The moonlight turned her skin to warm bronze. She sat by the creek, her long black hair falling like silk past her shoulders. Jonas McBride knew he should walk away. He knew it in his bones. She was promised to another man, a powerful Apache war chief, a man who would kill him without a second thought. But when Ayanna looked up at him with those honey-colored eyes, something moved in his battle-scarred chest. Something he thought had died with his wife back in Ohio. "What do you see when you look at me, Jonas?" she whispered. Her voice was like the stream flowing over smooth stones. Her fingers traced the raised scar on his knuckle, and it was like lightning shot up his arm, straight to his heart. She leaned closer, her lips just inches from his. He could smell sage and wildflowers in her hair, a scent that was wild and clean, and everything he'd forgotten existed. His hands, rough and calloused from war and work, found the delicate curve of her face. She sighed against his palm. It was the sound of a woman who had waited her whole life for a gentle touch. But then, in the distance, a wolf howled. Only it wasn't a wolf. Jonas knew that sound all too well. It was a signal, a warning. And in that one chilling moment, everything he thought he knew was about to be ripped apart. 3 weeks earlier, Jonas McBride rode through the gates of Fort Apache. He carried the weight of too many battles on his shoulders. At 35, he looked closer to 50. It was the kind of age that doesn't come from years, but from watching men die in ways no man should ever see. His blue eyes, once bright with the dreams of a new frontier, were now dull and distant. He had the 1,000-yard stare of a cavalry sergeant who'd buried too many friends in unmarked graves across the Montana Territory. The Indian Wars were over for most folks, but for Jonas, the war never ended. It lived in the slight tremor of his hands when a thunderstorm rolled in. It was in the way he could never sleep unless his back was pressed firmly against a solid wall. It was in the aching, empty space in his cot where his wife, Sarah, should have been. She died of consumption while he was away fighting at Little Bighorn. Her last letter, the one where she told him she was carrying their child, had reached him 3 days after they lowered her body into the cold Ohio soil. So he kept moving. He worked as an independent scout, guiding supply wagons through Arizona's most treacherous passes. The pay was good enough. The work was honest. But most importantly, it kept his boots in the stirrups and his mind off the past. Moving meant he didn't have to think about what he'd lost or what he'd done in the name of duty. Colonel William Davis met him in the shade of the fort's main building. Sweat stains darkened the armpits of his blue uniform, even in the cool October air. "McBride," the colonel said, his voice clipped and serious, "I need you to guide a supply train to Fort Grant." He spread a map out on a crate. 4 wagons, medical supplies, and ammunition. He tapped a long, winding line drawn through a series of jagged peaks. "The Apache have been quiet lately, but this canyon—" He looked up, his eyes hard as flint. "This canyon has swallowed 3 of my patrols this month. Not a single man found." Jonas studied the map. He saw the narrow passes, the blind turns, the high ridges perfect for an ambush. Apache Canyon was a killing ground. $200, Jonas said. His voice was flat. "Agreed," Davis said without hesitation. Then he lowered his voice, leaning in closer. "But McBride, there's a condition. I'm assigning you a second guide." Jonas raised an eyebrow. He always worked alone. "Someone who knows the Apache language," Davis continued. "Their customs, their signals." Jonas just nodded, figuring it would be some other grizzled, half-drunk scout like himself. He had no way of knowing this wasn't just another job. He had no idea that Colonel Davis wasn't telling him the whole truth. And he certainly didn't know that this decision, this one simple job, would force him to face every ghost he'd been running from, and introduce him to a few new ones. The trading post was a tired, old adobe building that looked like it had been bleached by the sun for 100 years. Its walls were scarred by sandstorms and pockmarked with old bullet holes. Jonas pushed through the swinging batwing doors, the dry hinges groaning in protest. He was expecting to meet his fellow guide, some old-timer with tobacco stains on his beard. Instead, he found himself staring at a woman who seemed to have walked out of a dream. She stood at the counter, her back as straight as a rifle barrel, arguing with the pot-bellied store clerk in a mix of perfect English and rapid-fire Spanish. She wore a simple brown dress, but it couldn't hide the strength in her shoulders or the proud way she held her head. Her long black hair was woven into a thick braid, decorated with small silver ornaments that glittered like trapped stars in the dim light. When she heard the doors swing open, she turned, and Jonas felt a jolt in his chest, a feeling he thought was buried forever. Her eyes were the color of dark honey, sharp and intelligent and utterly unafraid. They sized him up in a single, sweeping glance. It was the look of someone who had learned early that survival depended on reading a man's intentions in a heartbeat. She was Apache. That was plain as day. But there was something else there too, a quiet confidence, a sense of purpose that you didn't see every day. "You must be McBride," she said. Her English was flawless, but it held the soft, musical rhythm of her own people. "I'm Ayanna Santos. Colonel Davis sent me." Before Jonas could even form a reply, the bat-wing doors slammed open again. Three cowboys stumbled in, loud and drunk, reeking of cheap whiskey. The biggest of them, a red-faced man named Tucker with a gut spilling over his gun belt, locked his eyes on Ayanna. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. "Well, well," he slurred, swaggering toward her. "What's a pretty little Apache squaw doing in civilized company?" He moved closer, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Maybe you'd like to show me some of them special Indian customs I've been hearing about." His two friends laughed, moving to block her path, cutting off any chance of escape. Ayanna didn't move. She didn't flinch. But Jonas saw her hand drift down, her fingers brushing the handle of the long knife sheathed at her belt. In that instant, Jonas had a choice. He could do the smart thing, mind his own business, turn around, and walk out. Or he could step into a world of trouble for a woman he'd only known for 30 seconds. "The lady's with me," Jonas said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it cut through the drunken laughter like a razor. He stepped between Tucker and Ayanna, placing himself directly in the bigger man's path. "And she's busy." Tucker's whiskey-soaked eyes narrowed to angry slits. "I wasn't talking to you, Blue Belly," he snarled, using the old insult for a Union soldier. Jonas smiled, but it was a cold, dangerous thing that never came close to reaching his pale blue eyes. "No," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm, "but I'm talking to you, and I'm suggesting you and your friends find another place to do your drinking." The air in the trading post went thick and heavy. The silence stretched out, pulled as taut as a bowstring. Tucker stared into Jonas's eyes. He must have seen something there. Some old promise of violence, some ghost from 100 forgotten battles. Because after a long moment, the big man gave a slow, reluctant nod. He backed away, grabbing his friends and shuffling out the door without another word. When they were gone, Ayanna looked at Jonas, her expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes," Jonas replied, his gaze locked on hers. "I did." He didn't understand it himself. He hadn't stood up for anyone or anything in years. But looking at her, he knew he couldn't have done anything else. What he didn't know was that this one small act of defiance had just set in motion a chain of events that would end in blood and fire. Because Ayanna Santos was not what she seemed, and the trouble she was in was far more deadly than a few drunken cowboys. That evening, Jonas found her by the small creek that ran behind the trading post. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She was kneeling by the water's edge, washing blood from her knuckles. She looked up as he approached, no surprise in her dark eyes. It was as if she'd been expecting him. "The one called Tucker," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "He found me again after you left." She stood up, drying her hands on her skirt. "He won't be bothering anyone for a while." Jonas just stared at her. This woman was a complete contradiction. She could stand her ground against drunks, negotiate with traitors, and still look as elegant as a senator's wife. "Who are you, Ayanna Santos?" he asked, the question coming out rougher than he intended. She met his gaze directly. "My father was Miguel Santos, a cavalry scout, like you." The words hung in the air between them. He was Apache by blood, Spanish by name, raised in a Christian mission. He tried to live in both worlds. Her eyes held a deep, ancient sadness. "I speak 4 languages, Mr. McBride, and I've spent the last 5 years trying to help my people survive in a world that seems determined to wipe them out. She took a step closer to him. And you, Jonas McBride? Who are you when nobody is watching? The question hit him like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had asked him who he was, instead of what he did? I'm a man trying to outrun his ghosts, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. That's why you keep moving, she said. It wasn't a question. The scouting, the dangerous jobs. You think if you ride fast enough, they can't catch you. She looked out at the darkening landscape. But ghosts don't get tired, Jonas. They just wait. Before he could think of a reply, she turned to face him, her expression deadly serious. The supply wagon, the one leaving tomorrow, I know about it. Jonas felt his muscles tense. His hand instinctively moved closer to the Colt on his hip. My people know about it too, she continued, her voice low and urgent. There are warriors in my tribe calling for war. They say the white man's promises are lies written on the wind. They want the weapons and medicine on those wagons for one last, final fight. Are you warning me? Jonas asked, his voice a low growl. Or are you threatening me? I'm offering to ride with you, she said simply. As your guide, like the colonel arranged, but also as something more. She held his gaze, her dark eyes pleading, as someone who might be able to stop the bloodshed on both sides. Jonas was suspicious. This was all too convenient. Why would you do that? He asked. Betray your own people for a handful of soldiers? A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Betray them? Jonas, I'm trying to save them. My people are the bravest people on earth. But this is a war we cannot win. The smart ones know this. The question isn't whether we die. It's whether we die fighting a pointless war or find a new way to live. She took another step, so close now he could feel the warmth radiating from her. The scent of sage was stronger, intoxicating. Tomorrow that supply train will carry enough rifles to arm 100 warriors, enough to get every single one of them killed when the army retaliates. Her eyes burned with a fierce intensity. But with the right guide, with someone the Apache trust, it could pass through the canyon safely. No shots fired. Everyone lives to see another sunset. Jonas found himself looking at the curve of her lips as she spoke, and he had to force himself to focus. And what's in it for you? He asked. Hope, she whispered, the word so quiet he barely heard it. Hope that there's still time for something besides hatred. It sounded good. It sounded noble. But a part of Jonas, the old soldier part that had kept him alive for so long, was screaming that this was a lie. He was walking into a trap, and this beautiful, mysterious woman was the bait. Dawn broke like a bloodstain over the jagged peaks of Apache Canyon. The 4 heavy supply wagons sat in the fort's courtyard like fat, helpless targets. 12 soldiers, most of them fresh-faced recruits who'd never seen a real fight, checked their rifles with nervous, fumbling hands. They all knew they were riding straight into hell. Sergeant Tom Murphy, an old friend of Jonas's from the cavalry days, pulled him aside as they prepared to mount up. Murphy was a hard man, with a face like a worn leather map and eyes that had seen it all. I don't like this, Jonas, he grumbled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. That Apache girl, she's too pretty, too smart, and way too willing to help us out. It feels like a setup. Jonas glanced over at Ayanna. She'd swapped her dress for practical riding leathers and was adjusting her horse's bridle with a calm, practiced ease. The clothes couldn't hide the natural grace in her movements. Maybe, Jonas said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Or maybe she's exactly who she says she is. Murphy snorted. When did you get so damn trusting? About the same time you got so suspicious of everyone. About the same time I started collecting scars, Murphy shot back, tapping a long, jagged one that ran through his eyebrow. Same as you, McBride. Same as you. The first day of the journey was quiet. Too quiet. They wound their way through massive redstone canyons that rose up on either side of the trail like the walls of a forgotten cathedral. Jonas and Ayanna rode point, their horses picking their way carefully over the loose rock. Every boulder looked like a potential hiding place for a dozen snipers. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered warning. Ayanna, for her part, was an incredible guide. She seemed to know every hidden spring, every game trail, every narrow pass where the canyon walls squeezed in tight enough to make the hair on your neck stand up. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, she led them to a sheltered grove of cottonwood trees where a small spring bubbled up from between the rocks. "We'll camp here," she announced, swinging down from her horse with a fluid motion. "There's good water, it's a defensible position, and our fire won't be easily seen from the main trail." She was right. It was a perfect spot, almost too perfect. As the soldiers set up camp, Jonas found himself watching her. He watched the way she moved around the perimeter, her eyes scanning the rocks above, her hand never far from her knife. She checked the ground for tracks, her fingers brushing against the bark of a tree as if she was reading a message carved there. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in this harsh, unforgiving land. Later that night, around the small cook fire, the soldiers started telling stories. War stories and tales of lost loves. The kind of things men talk about when they know they might not live to see another sunrise. One young private, a kid from back east, asked Ayana about her family. She spoke quietly about her father, the scout who tried to bridge two worlds. "He believed in honor," she said, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the crackle of the flames. "He thought if Apache blood could serve alongside white blood, there could be peace." She stared into the fire, her face a mask of sorrow. "The bullets that killed him," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "came from both sides." Jonas felt something twist in his gut as he watched her. He recognized the weight of the burdens she carried. They were different from his, but they were just as heavy. But then, something happened. Sergeant Murphy, who had been sitting silently on the other side of the fire, suddenly stood up. He walked over to Jonas and spoke in a low, urgent whisper. "While she was telling her sob story," Murphy hissed, "I did some looking around." He opened his hand. Lying in his palm was a single black eagle feather tied with a strip of red leather. "I found this tucked under her saddle blanket, Jonas." Jonas's blood ran cold. He knew what it was. It was the personal sigil of a war chief, a man named Nalnish, the most feared and violent of all the Apache leaders, a man who had sworn to drive every last white man from Arizona. "She's not leading us to safety, Jonas," Murphy whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "She's leading us to a slaughter." The second night, they were camped deep in a box canyon. The walls were so high and sheer that the stars looked like a handful of scattered diamonds thrown onto black velvet. The soldiers, exhausted from a day of wrestling, the wagons up treacherous switchbacks, had turned in early. But Jonas couldn't sleep. Murphy's discovery had planted a seed of poison in his mind. The eagle feather, Nalnish's mark. Was Ayana a traitor? Was this whole thing an elaborate trap? He found himself walking to the edge of the camp, toward the small stream that trickled through the rocks. He thought the sound of the water might quiet the war raging in his own head. But she was already there. Ayana was sitting on a smooth, flat boulder, her back to him. She had unbraided her hair, and it fell down her back like a waterfall of black silk, shimmering in the moonlight. She must have heard him approach, because she turned her head. Something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken understanding of the tension that had been crackling in the air since they first met. The moonlight softened the hard lines of her face, making her look younger, more vulnerable. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur. Jonas sat down on the rock beside her. He was careful to keep some distance between them, even though every instinct he had was screaming at him to move closer. "It's too quiet," he said, his voice rough. "In the war, the quiet was always the most dangerous part. It always meant trouble was coming." "For my people," she replied, turning to face him fully, "the quiet means the spirits are watching." He caught that scent again, sage and wildflowers. It made his head spin. "What do you see when you look at me, Jonas?" she asked again, the same question she'd asked before, but this time it felt different, heavier, the question he'd been avoiding. He could feel the cold weight of the eagle feather in his pocket. He should confront her. He should demand the truth, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, a different truth came out. "I see a woman trying to save her people," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Someone braver than she has any right to be." He saw something flicker in her eyes. Relief, gratitude, and, he continued, the words tumbling out before he could stop them, I see someone who makes me remember what it feels like to want something. Something besides just surviving. She moved closer then, just a few inches. But it was enough. Her thigh brushed against his and a fire ignited in his veins. I'm promised to another man, she whispered, her voice laced with pain. Nalnish, a war chief from the Chiricahua. The name hit Jonas like a punch to the gut. Nalnish, the man whose feather was hidden in his pocket. It was an arrangement, she went on, her eyes fixed on the ground. Made when I was 16. A political alliance to unite the tribes against the army. Do you love him? Jonas asked, his own question surprising him. Her laugh was a short, bitter sound. Love. I've never had the choice to love anyone. My life has been about duty, about doing what is best for my people. She looked up at him, and her eyes were shining. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the scar on his knuckle, just as they had before. Until now. That single touch shattered what was left of his control. The doubt, the suspicion, the feather in his pocket, it all vanished. There was only this woman, this moment. He knew he should pull away. He should remember he was a soldier on a mission. He should remember the men sleeping just a few yards away, their lives in his hands. He should remember Nalnish. Instead, he found himself cupping her face in his calloused palm. Ayana, he breathed. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. I know it's impossible, she whispered. I know what people would say, what this would mean, for both our worlds. But Jonas, when you look at me, I don't feel like a political pawn. I don't feel like a bridge between two worlds. I just feel like myself. She opened her eyes and they were bright with unshed tears and a deep, raw desire that mirrored the fire raging in his own soul. The space between them crackled. Jonas leaned forward, pulled in by a force stronger than reason, stronger than duty. Her lips were soft and warm and tasted of desperation and hope. When she sighed against his mouth, it felt like something inside him, something that had been frozen solid since Sarah's death, suddenly cracked and blazed back to life. His hands tangled in the silk of her hair as she pressed herself against him. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons on his shirt, and his own hands traced the graceful line of her neck, the delicate bones of her shoulders. She was everything he thought the world had lost. She was silk and steel, fire and water. And then a wolf howled in the distance, a long, mournful, chilling sound. They broke apart as if they'd been struck by lightning. The signals, she breathed, her eyes wide with a sudden, terrible fear. That's not a wolf. Jonas was already on his feet, his gun in his hand. He knew that sound. He knew who it was. That's Nalnish. The war cry ripped through the canyon stillness like a bolt of lightning. Jonas shoved Ayana behind the boulder just as an arrow slammed into the rock where his head had been a second before, embedding itself with a solid thump. The camp exploded into chaos. Soldiers scrambled from their bedrolls, grabbing for rifles, shouting confused orders into the darkness. Muzzle flashes lit up the canyon walls in brief, terrifying strobes. How many? Jonas yelled over the gunfire, pulling Ayana down as another volley of arrows rained down on them. 20, maybe more, she yelled back, her voice remarkably steady despite the hell breaking loose around them. Nalnish brought warriors from 3 different tribes. He's not just here for the wagons, Jonas. She grabbed his arm, her eyes locking with his. He's here for me. Sergeant Murphy crawled over to them, his face a grim mask in the flickering light of the firefight. A line of blood trickled down from his hairline. It's a coordinated attack, he shouted. They've got us pinned down from 3 sides. They knew exactly where we'd camp, exactly where to put their men. His furious, accusatory glare landed squarely on Ayana. Someone told them our position. Jonas moved, placing himself between Murphy and Ayana. She saved our lives just now, he countered. Without her warning, we'd all be dead. But even as he said it, the doubt crept back in. The eagle feather felt like a lump of ice in his pocket. Had her warning been part of the act? A way to gain his trust before the final slaughter? The deeper bark of rifle fire joined the arrows. The Apache had modern weapons, likely taken from the very patrols that had vanished in this canyon. This wasn't some desperate raid. This was a well-planned, well-armed military operation. "The wagons!" a young private shrieked. Jonas looked over just in time to see a flaming arrow arc through the night and bury itself in the canvas cover of the medical supply wagon. The canvas caught instantly, erupting into a tower of fire, and through the swirling smoke and chaos, Jonas saw him. Nalnish. He moved like a phantom between the rocks, his face painted for war, making him almost invisible in the dancing shadows. He was younger than Jonas had pictured, maybe 25, with the lean, muscular build of a man who had known nothing but war his entire life. But it was his eyes that froze Jonas's blood. They burned with the fanatical certainty of a man who believes he is an instrument of God, a man fighting for destiny itself. "Ayana!" Nalnish's voice sliced through the noise of the battle like a knife. "Come to me now, and the white soldiers will be allowed to live. Continue this betrayal, and I will feed their hearts to the coyotes." Ayana started to stand up, but Jonas grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. "Don't," he hissed. "It's a lie. He's not going to let anyone live, no matter what you do." "How do you know?" she pleaded, her eyes wide with terror. "Because I've seen that look before," Jonas said grimly. "In a mirror." He checked the rounds in his Winchester by feel, the familiar clicks a small comfort in the chaos. "He's not here to bargain," Jonas said. "He's here to make a statement." As if Jonas's words had summoned him, Nalnish appeared on a high ridge above them, a fearsome silhouette against the star-dusted sky. Even from 50 yards away, Jonas could feel the crushing weight of the war chief's stare. This wasn't about weapons anymore. It wasn't about politics. This was personal. "You want her?" Jonas found himself yelling, the words ripped from his throat by pure, raw defiance. "Then you come and take her." Nalnish's laugh was a cold, cruel sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "The white soldier thinks he is a hero," the war chief called back. "You think you can claim what belongs to the Apache. You know nothing of her, white man, nothing of what she means to the future of our people." "I know she deserves better than to be treated like property," Jonas roared back. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the gunfire had been. Then Nalnish slowly raised his rifle. The barrel glinted in the firelight. "Then die for her, white man," Nalnish's voice boomed across the canyon. "Die like the dog you are." The rifle cracked, the sound echoing like a clap of thunder. Jonas felt the bullet buzz past his ear, so close it felt like it parted his hair, before it sparked violently off the rock behind him. He rolled, bringing his own rifle up, but Nalnish had already melted back into the shadows. The battle was just beginning, and Jonas suddenly realized Nalnish didn't just want to win. He wanted to make Jonas suffer first. He wanted to break him, and the terrifying part was he knew exactly how to do it. The attack intensified. Apache warriors, moving with terrifying speed and silence, pressed in from all sides. They were ghosts in the darkness, their movements economical and deadly. "He's trying to draw you out," Ayana whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "This isn't how my people fight, not out in the open at night." Nalnish is letting his anger cloud his judgment. "Good," Jonas replied through gritted teeth. "Angry men make mistakes." But as he spoke, he knew they were losing. Badly. 3 soldiers were already down. He could see the still form of young Private Rodriguez, the kid who had been talking about his sweetheart back in Santa Fe just hours ago. The remaining men were low on ammunition, huddled behind the burning wagons, their faces pale with terror. "Jonas!" Sergeant Murphy crawled over, his face smeared with blood and gunpowder. "We have to break out of here, now! Leave the damn wagons, grab the horses, and make a run for Fort Grant." "What about the wounded?" Jonas yelled back. Murphy's face was a mask of grim reality. "What about them? It's 7 miles of hell to the fort, and we've got maybe 30 rounds left between all of us. You do the math, McBride. We run, or we all die right here." Jonas looked at the terrified faces of the surviving soldiers. Boys. Most of them weren't old enough to grow a proper beard. They were looking at him, waiting for an order, waiting for a miracle. Then he looked at Ayana. Her eyes weren't filled with terror. They held a fierce, defiant resolve that cut straight through his own fear and doubt. And in that one crystal-clear moment, Jonas understood. For years he'd been running from the ghosts of the men he couldn't save at Little Bighorn, running from the guilt of decisions made in the fog of war. But right here, right now, he had a choice. It wasn't between duty and desire. It was between the man he had been and the man Ayanna made him want to become. No, he said, his voice firm and clear. We're not leaving anyone behind. Murphy stared at him, his mouth agape. For God's sake, Jonas, has that woman twisted you up so bad you can't think straight anymore? Maybe, Jonas said, checking the last 6 rounds in his own rifle. Or maybe I'm thinking clearly for the first time in a decade. He turned to Ayanna. This isn't just about you. It's about doing the right thing. But as he said the words, a cold new thought sliced through his mind. Murphy's words echoed. They knew exactly where we'd camp. The perfect spot Ayanna had chosen. The convenient discovery of the eagle feather, which Jonas now realized Murphy could have planted himself. What if Ayanna wasn't the traitor? What if the real traitor was the man he trusted most? The attack suddenly faltered. The shooting became sporadic. A new voice called out from the darkness. This one in perfect English. It wasn't Nalnish. It was a cold, calm voice. Sergeant Murphy, your payment is waiting. Bring us the girl and the scout, and you can ride out of here with your gold. The world seemed to stop. Jonas turned slowly, his eyes locking with Murphy's. The old sergeant's face was a mess of shock and terror. He wasn't acting. He was just as stunned as Jonas, which meant the betrayal ran even deeper. The voice came again. Colonel Davis sends his regards, McBride. He knew you were too stubborn to follow orders. Colonel Davis. The whole thing, from the very beginning, had been a setup. The mission, the guide, the route through the canyon. They weren't meant to deliver supplies. They were sent here to die. The revelation hit Jonas like a physical blow. Colonel Davis, his commanding officer, the man who sent them here. It wasn't an Apache ambush, not really. It was an execution squad, with Nalnish's warriors used as a convenient cover. What's he talking about, Jonas? Murphy stammered, his face pale as a ghost. Payment? What gold? They're not here for the wagons, Tom, Jonas said, his mind racing, putting the pieces together. They're here for her. He looked at Ayanna, and for the first time, he saw not just a brave woman, but a target. My father, Ayanna said, her voice trembling, but her eyes burning with a sudden, terrible understanding. My father was a scout under Colonel Davis. He found something out, something about a mining company and illegal gold shipments being run through Apache territory using army supply wagons as cover. The truth was a snake, uncoiling in the darkness. Davis had him killed, she continued. He made it look like an ambush, blamed it on both sides. But my father left me a journal. He knew Davis would come for him. The journal has names, dates, shipment routes, everything. It's hidden back at the trading post. This wasn't about weapons or medicine. This was a cover-up, and they were the loose ends. You must be the girl, the calm voice called out again. A man stepped out from behind a rock, holding a torch. He wasn't Apache. He was a white man, dressed in dark clothes with the cold eyes of a hired killer. He held a brand new Henry repeating rifle. Colonel Davis and the Wentworth Mining Company offer their sincere apologies for this inconvenience, the man said with a slight mocking bow. But your father's legacy has become problematic. Behind him, more men appeared, at least a dozen, all white, all armed with top-of-the-line rifles, mercenaries. And you, McBride, the man said, turning his cold gaze on Jonas. You were just supposed to be the tragic hero who died trying to protect his men from a savage ambush. A sad story to cover up the loose ends, but you, sir, have become a complication. Suddenly, Nalnish appeared on the ridge again, but this time he wasn't looking at Jonas. He was staring in disbelief at the mercenaries. What is this sorcery? Nalnish roared. Who are these men? Your services are no longer required, Chief, the lead mercenary called up to him. Your payment will be left for you, as promised. Now take your men and go. Betrayal layered on top of betrayal. Davis hadn't just set Jonas up to die. He'd hired Nalnish's warriors to start the attack, to make it look legitimate, planning to have his own men sweep in and kill everyone, Apache and soldier alike, leaving no witnesses. Nalnish's face contorted in a mask of pure fury. He had been used. His honor, his warriors, used as pawns in a white man's greedy game. He let out a piercing war cry, but it wasn't a cry of attack. It was a cry of rage and defiance. "No white man uses Nalnish as a tool," he screamed. He turned to Jonas, his eyes blazing. "It seems we have a common enemy, Scout." The lead mercenary just chuckled. "So be it. Kill them all. Leave nothing but ashes." The mercenaries raised their rifles. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and caught between two forces that wanted them dead. Jonas looked at the handful of terrified soldiers, at the grim-faced Sergeant Murphy, at the defiant Ayanna, and at the enraged Apache war chief on the ridge above. The odds weren't just bad, they were impossible. The world erupted in a storm of lead. The mercenaries' Henry repeaters spat fire and death into the small camp. Their rate of fire was devastating, pinning down what was left of Jonas's small command. "To the rocks!" Jonas screamed, grabbing Ayanna and shoving her toward a cluster of large boulders that offered better cover than the burning wagons. Murphy and the two remaining privates scrambled after them, bullets kicking up dust all around their feet. From the ridges above, Nalnish's warriors, now realizing they'd been betrayed, began to return fire. Their older rifles were no match for the mercenaries' firepower, but their knowledge of the terrain was superior. They became ghosts, firing from one position before melting away to appear in another. An unlikely and desperate alliance was born in the chaos. Soldier and Apache fighting back-to-back against a common foe. "McBride!" The lead mercenary's voice called out over the din. "Give us the girl. She's the only one we need alive. The rest of you can die quick." "Go to hell!" Jonas roared back, firing his Winchester at a muzzle flash. "My father's journal!" Ayanna yelled to him over the gunfire. "That's what they really want. It's the only proof against them." "Where is it?" "I have it," she said, pulling a small leather-bound book from inside her shirt. "I never leave it. I thought I could give it to the commander at Fort Grant." Jonas's blood ran cold. She'd been carrying the evidence on her the entire time. That's why Davis needed her dead before she reached another fort. Another officer who wasn't on his payroll. A bullet ricocheted off the rock near Jonas's head, spraying his face with stone fragments. One of the young privates screamed and clutched his leg, a dark stain spreading across his trousers. They couldn't stay here. They were being picked apart. Suddenly, a figure dropped down from the rocks above them, landing with a silent grace. It was Nolnish. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with a hatred so intense it was almost a physical force. He ignored the soldiers, his gaze fixed on Jonas and Ayanna. "The White Chief Davis," Nalnish said, his voice a low growl. "He promised me weapons. He told me this wagon train was a secret army shipment to armed settlers on our land. He told me he gestured to Ayanna, was a traitor helping them." "He lied to us all," Jonas said, reloading his rifle. Nalnish looked from Jonas to Ayanna, and a flicker of something, regret, understanding, passed through his eyes. "You fight for her," he said. It wasn't a question. "I fight for what's right," Jonas countered. The war chief grunted. "There is a way out," he said. "A narrow passage at the back of the canyon. My people use it to hunt mountain cats. These hired guns won't know it's there. But we have to draw their fire, create a diversion." It was a classic military tactic, a suicide mission for whoever stayed behind. "I will lead the diversion," Nalnish stated, as if there was no other option. "My warriors will follow me. It is a good day to die." "No," Jonas said. Everyone stared at him. "We all fight. We all leave. Or we all die," Jonas said, his eyes hard. "No one gets left behind." For a long moment, the Apache war chief and the cavalry scout stared at each other. Two men from different worlds, sworn enemies just an hour ago. Nalnish gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Then we show these dogs how warriors fight," he said. He turned to Ayanna. "You are the daughter of Miguel Santos. He was an honorable man. I am sorry I did not see his honor in you." Then he turned back to Jonas. "You have the heart of a warrior, Jonas McBride. But this fight will take more than heart. It will take a miracle." Jonas chambered around. He gave a cold, grim smile. "Good," he said. "I was due for one." But as he looked out at the ring of fire closing in on them, he knew a miracle was exactly what they were going to need. The mercenaries were closing in, moving from rock to rock with cold, professional efficiency. This wasn't a battle, it was an extermination. The plan was desperate, born from the chaos. Nalnish and his 3 remaining warriors would create a distraction on the left flank, drawing the mercenaries' attention with a sudden, ferocious charge. In that moment of confusion, Jonas, Murphy, and Ayanna would lead the wounded private toward the hidden passage Nalnish had described. "Ready?" Jonas whispered, crouched beside the Apache chief. Nalnish didn't answer. He was chanting softly in his own language, his eyes closed. A prayer or a death song, Jonas couldn't tell. Then he opened his eyes and they were like burning coals. "Now!" he hissed. Nalnish and his warriors erupted from behind the rocks with a terrifying scream, charging directly at the mercenaries' line. The hired guns, caught by surprise, swung their rifles toward the new threat. "Go! Go now!" Murphy yelled, half carrying the wounded private. Jonas grabbed Ayanna's hand, pulling her along as they scrambled over the rocks at the back of the canyon, away from the main fight. The sound of the battle was horrifying. The steady, heavy reports of the Henry rifles mixed with the desperate war cries of the Apache. Jonas didn't look back. He couldn't. They found the passage, a crack in the canyon wall barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Murphy shoved the private through first, then scrambled in after him. Jonas pushed Ayanna toward the opening. "Get in," he commanded. She hesitated, her eyes filled with tears as she looked back toward the sounds of the fight. "Nalnish." "He's buying us time," Jonas said, his voice raw. "Don't let it be for nothing. Go!" She squeezed through the crack. Jonas started to follow, but then he stopped. He looked back at the battle. He saw one of Nalnish's warriors fall, then another. He saw Nalnish fighting like a cornered lion, a tomahawk in one hand and a long knife in the other, taking down 2 mercenaries before a third shot him in the side. The war chief staggered but kept fighting, and Jonas knew he couldn't run. Not again. He couldn't leave another man to die while he saved himself. He couldn't live with another ghost. "Jonas, what are you doing?" Ayanna cried from inside the passage. He turned to her, his face set like stone. "Get them to safety," he told her. "Take the journal. Expose Davis. Make this all mean something." "No, I'm not leaving you." "You have to," he said, and his voice softened. He reached out and touched her cheek, one last time. "For the first time in a long time, I know exactly what I'm fighting for. Now go." He didn't wait for her reply. He turned and ran back into the fight. He saw the lead mercenary standing over the wounded Nalnish, raising his rifle for the final, killing shot. "Hey!" Jonas yelled. The mercenary turned, a look of surprise on his face. It was all the time Jonas needed. He raised his Winchester and fired his last bullet. The mercenary crumpled to the ground. Jonas threw his empty rifle aside and drew his Colt, firing at the remaining hired guns, screaming, drawing their fire, buying a few more precious seconds for Ayanna and the others to escape. He felt a searing pain in his shoulder as a bullet hit him, spinning him around. He fell to one knee, but he kept firing. Another bullet tore through his leg. He collapsed onto the ground, his pistol falling from his numb fingers. 2 mercenaries advanced on him, their rifles leveled. This was it, the end. He closed his eyes, a strange sense of peace washing over him. He had not run. He had made his stand. He thought of Sarah. He thought of Ayanna. But the final shots never came. Instead, he heard the thunder of hoofbeats, dozens of them. He opened his eyes. Pouring into the canyon from the main trail was a full platoon of cavalry, their sabers drawn, their blue uniforms a beautiful sight under the moonlight. And at their head, riding hard, was Colonel Davis. But his face wasn't the face of a rescuer. It was the face of a man whose carefully laid plans had just gone horribly, catastrophically wrong. He had come to survey the massacre, to make sure there were no survivors. Instead, he'd ridden straight into the middle of his own crime scene, with witnesses. Jonas lay on the ground, his vision swimming in and out of focus. He saw Colonel Davis rein in his horse, his face a perfect picture of shock and fury. He had expected to find a canyon littered with bodies and a plausible story of an Apache attack gone wrong. Instead, he found a bloodbath involving his own hired mercenaries, a handful of surviving soldiers, and the two people he had sent here specifically to be silenced. "What in God's name happened here, McBride?" Davis boomed, trying to regain control, to play the part of the commanding officer arriving at a tragedy. But it was too late. Sergeant Murphy, his face grim, stepped out from the narrow passage. "He set us up, sir," Murphy said, his voice ringing with betrayal, speaking not to Jonas, but to the young lieutenant riding beside Davis. "The colonel, he hired these guns. It was an execution." The lieutenant, a young, by-the-book officer, looked from Murphy to the dead mercenaries, then to his shell-shocked colonel. Confusion and suspicion warred on his face, and then Ayanna stepped out. She held up her father's journal. "The proof is in here, Lieutenant," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing off the canyon walls. "Proof that Colonel Davis has been working with the Wentworth Mining Company, using army wagons to smuggle stolen gold, and murdering anyone who got in his way, including my father, Scout Miguel Santos." Davis's face went white. He was trapped. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape, for some way to salvage the situation. His hand drifted down toward his pistol, but before he could draw, a wounded figure rose up from behind a rock. It was Nalnish. He was bleeding heavily from a wound in his side, but his eyes burned with an all-consuming fire. In his hand, he held a single captured Henry repeating rifle. "Your lies die with you, White Chief," Nalnish snarled. He fired one shot. Colonel Davis stiffened in his saddle, a look of complete surprise on his face. He looked down at the dark red circle blooming on the chest of his uniform, then toppled sideways off his horse and lay still in the dust. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. The young lieutenant, his face pale, stared at Nalnish. His men raised their rifles. "Hold your fire!" the lieutenant commanded, his voice shaking but firm. He looked at the scene around him. Dead soldiers, dead mercenaries, a bleeding Apache chief, and the damning journal in Ayanna's hand. He was smart enough to know this was something far bigger and uglier than a simple ambush. Nalnish dropped the rifle and collapsed, clutching his side. Ayanna rushed to his side, tearing a strip from her shirt to press against the wound. Jonas tried to push himself up, but a wave of dizziness sent him crashing back to the ground. The last thing he saw before the world went black was Ayanna's face, her beautiful, honey-colored eyes looking down at him, full of fear and something else, something he had waited his entire life to see. 6 months later, Jonas stood on the porch of the small adobe house he had built with his own two hands. The Arizona sun was warm on his face. His left arm had healed crooked, a permanent, aching reminder of that night in the canyon. He would never again have the quick draw that had once defined him. But he found he didn't mind. His hands were better suited for other things now. Building a home, planting a garden, holding his wife. He watched Ayanna in the yard, tending to the rows of corn and squash. She wore a simple blue dress, and she'd woven wildflowers from her garden into her long, black hair. She looked up and saw him watching, and her smile was brighter than the morning sun. The scandal of Colonel Davis and the Wentworth Mining Company had shaken the territory to its core. The journal, combined with the testimony of Jonas, Murphy, and the young lieutenant, had been undeniable. The conspiracy was unraveled, and powerful men went to prison. Justice had been done. Nalnish had survived. He and Jonas had spoken once more before he led what was left of his people back into the mountains. They had not parted as friends. The gulf between their worlds was too wide for that, but they had parted with a shared, grudging respect. Two warriors who had seen the truth in each other. Jonas and Ayanna's wedding had been a quiet affair. Sergeant Murphy stood as his best man. A few Apache families who saw the union as a symbol of a new beginning had come to celebrate. Together they had started a school. In the small one-room schoolhouse, the children of settlers sat beside Apache children. They learned to read and write, to add and subtract. Ayanna taught them the old stories and the history of her people, while Jonas taught them how to mend a fence and track a deer. It wasn't a perfect life. There were still whispers and sideways glances in town. There were still old hatreds that died hard. But it was a start. It was hope, made real. Some nights the ghost still came for Jonas. He would dream of the smoke and thunder of Little Bighorn, of Sarah's last, fading letter. But now when he woke up in a cold sweat, Ayana was there. Her warmth, her strength, chased away the shadows. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers tracing the old scar on his knuckle. "What do you see when you look at me, Jonas McBride?" She whispered, her eyes dancing with love. He pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of sage and wildflowers. "I see my life," he said. "I see home." He had spent so many years running, surviving, just trying to make it to the next sunrise. But he finally understood. Surviving isn't the same as living, and love, he realized, makes all the difference. If you enjoyed this story of redemption and hope, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And be sure to drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love connecting with fellow lovers of classic Western tales from all around the world. Thanks for stopping by.